learn things about disability management or something like that. We have had some of those in the past, but not so much anymore. So most of the services that we provide, they're considered clinical services. So like one really good example of that is academic lab that I was talking about. So it's every weekday from 3 to 4:30. Today is actually the last day because finals are starting, and this room is going to be converted to also be used for testing. So we're going to put up some tables and chairs and curtains and dividers so people will test in here during finals. And it's in this room, and it's an hour and a half every afternoon. I'm in here as an academic coach. We have some community health interns who intern with us. We have 3 this semester, and they'll usually be in here as well. So I had a student come to lab yesterday. You can actually see the erasings on the board. We were putting together a study plan for finals, and he was a student who typically just crammed for finals. He has ADHD. Cramming never worked. He wanted to come up with a study schedule and a plan that was more doable. So we sat and we used a couple of strategies, anti-cramming strategies, different study strategies, and we mapped out like a study program for him for finals. And students will come to lab with all kinds of different things that they want to work on. Sometimes people come to lab just for a quiet space to sit and work. So lab, like I said, is that drop-in place where people will come just for whatever kind of support like that they need. We usually have between 1 and 3 people come to lab each day. Sometimes we have as many as like 7 or 8 people. Some days there's nobody that comes to lab. And that's a typical kind of example of a service that we provide to help students be better learners.
If a student does feel like they have a learning disability, how do they go about being involved with that?
So there's a couple things. One, this brochure doesn't necessarily talk very much about it. It kind of refers to getting registered with DRES. To use the services at DRES, you have to register with us. And there's 2 steps to that. So one step is just filling out an application online. That's very easy to do. It's mostly demographic information. And then the other step is to provide documentation of a disability. And that can come from a variety of sources, but usually it comes from a person who has diagnosed the disability. So if a person has I think you mentioned learning disability, for example. So we're usually looking for a report or an evaluation from somebody like a psychologist who has tested a student and been able to look at the pattern of performance on those tests and say, yeah, this is consistent with a learning disability. It's best when they make some recommendations and for services or accommodations, because that helps us know what services to provide. So students will come in with documentation. That's the other step. So the application and then the documentation. And if you go to our website, there's a tab that says applying for services, and it explains all this in detail. But the other thing that we do here is we have a neuropsych testing unit. So if students feel that they may have an undiagnosed disability like ADHD or a learning disability or autism or really anything like that, and they've never been evaluated before, they can come to our testing clinic here and get evaluated. We have a really, really high demand for that service. So sometimes we have to turn people away. It starts with an academic screening. So it's basically just a really long interview about everything that's going on in a person's life. And that tells us where to go from there. Do they need comprehensive testing because we think there is something like a learning disability? Do they need to come back and talk with a counselor for more interviewing because we think it's something like the onset of bipolar disorder or an anxiety disorder? Sometimes people have anxiety and they mistake it for ADHD. It's hard to pay attention to things when you're distracted and anxious. So people will say, I think I have ADHD, and they come through testing and it turns out that it's really anxiety. And then we have people in the end for feedback sessions. So basically we're making a diagnosis or saying that there's no diagnosis. And that can serve as the documentation piece as well. One thing that's pretty clear if you write about this or tell anybody about this, you must know is that this is only for students who have never been evaluated before. We have students who will often say, well, I was diagnosed with ADHD in 3rd grade, I want to get registered with DRES. And we'll say, great, submit some documentation, and they say, well, my doctor, he died, and I can't get documentation of that. And we'll say, okay, well then go to a new doctor. And students will say to us, well, you can test me, can't you? And we say, no, you've been diagnosed before. So our testing is only for students who've never accessed that kind of service before.
Is that because you guys have such a high demand for it?
Yes. Yeah, it is. And I mean, so the law says that if a person gets registered with DRES, it is their responsibility to show, and another way to say it is to prove that they have a disability. So the fact that we do this is really rare. There are a few other places that will do this. I don't know of a single other place that does it with no charge. Most places, like Illinois State University, has a service like this, and they charge $500 for an evaluation. Professionally, if you were to go in the Chicago suburbs and get testing like this, it's anywhere between $1,000 and $4,000 to get testing like this. So there's no charge for it here, and that's part of the reason why the demand is so high. But also, people will say things like, well, I was diagnosed when I was a kid with ADHD or a learning disability, and they won't have records of it. So to get registered, they have to have records, and we don't bear the responsibility of generating new records for everybody just because they don't have old records.
Like, what is the relationship between DRES and like parents of children with disabilities?
That's a good question. So the prevailing kind of notion is that students come to college and it represents a break from K-12 education where their parents were really kind of in control of everything in their lives.
Yeah.
And now, as an adult, they're in control of their grades and their classes and their major and things like that. So you may know, you may have experienced, so one, you have privacy rights. There's a set of laws called the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act that your professors, if your parents contacted your professor, they're legally not allowed to give you or to give them your grades. They just can't do it. And the same thing applies with everything from DRES. Now, technically, if you sign a release that says you can talk to my parents about this, then it's no longer illegal to share information. But your professors aren't going to make time to do that. They don't consider that it's their job to talk to your parents. It's a little bit that way here too. One example that I'll give you is that I may have a new student and I'll talk with them about services, and I'll explain that we have lab and we have coaching and we have support groups, and if they're having trouble, they really need to get connected with us and stay connected with us, and there's a lot that we can do to help. And then a couple semesters will go by and I won't hear anything from the student, which is okay. People don't have to come in and get that kind of support or help. But what might happen is I'll get an email from a parent saying, my child is struggling, I want to know what you can do for him or do for her, here's what's going on, can you tell me how things are going in their classes? And kind of our first response is, no, I can't, I can't even tell you that they're registered with us, because I don't have unless I have a release on file that says I can talk to you. And so what I typically do is I'll reach out to the student. I'll say, we got some contact with your parent. They said that they had some concerns about how things are going for you. And sometimes, by the way, parents don't want us to say that, right? They don't want to seem like they're meddling. But we can't keep that private. Like anything that a parent tells us about a student technically is a part of their record, and they have a right to know that. So we'll tell a student, like, your parent contacted us. They're really hoping that you'll come to academic lab or do coaching with us. Would you like to do that? And sometimes they'll say, oh, no, I'm okay. My mom's just overreacting. Or they just won't respond at all. And then the parent will contact us again saying, how come you're not getting them in for coaching? And, we essentially say, look, it's their choice. They make the decisions about what kind of supports and services that they want to use. There's some exceptions to that. Sometimes students and parents will plan for more interaction. An example that I'll give you is, like, if a student gets dismissed and they petition and they get back in, a parent might say something like, I will agree to pay for your schooling as long as you're using this service at DRES and they're telling me that you're coming to your appointments and things like that. We'll cooperate with that, because if we don't, the parent's not going to let their student come to school here. Those are some thoughts about that. Does that
Yeah,
answer the question?
thank you.
Okay.
Going back to transportation, is there like a certain